We're in the grip of a different pandemic. It's not so deadly personally, but it causes expensive waste in our organisations and puts the process-based management project in jeopardy. It's KPI disease. There's no doubt that we need to measure process performance. We do need process KPIs, but they need to be the right ones for the right processes. And they need to be actively used every day as strategic and operational management tools. There's nothing to be gained and a lot to be lost by making long lists of process KPIs that will never be used. That's KPI disease. How many process KPIs do you need? How many could you manage? Let's think about what a healthy process performance regime might look like. First thing we can acknowledge is that we do need process KPIs. We have to be able to measure and manage process performance so that we'll know whether we're improving it. So we do need to have process KPIs. What we need to avoid, though, is an avalanche of process KPIs that's going to give us a ton of data and zero insight into process performance. The whole point of process-based management is to improve organizational performance. And we don't want to get swamped with irrelevant material. We want to be focused on the processes that matter, the minimum number of KPIs, minimum number of targets that will allow us to achieve our organizational performance improvement goals. So KPIs are important, but we need to avoid KPI disease. And there are many symptoms of KPI disease. These are four of them, four important symptoms that we'll look at in this video. So it's about the quality of the KPIs, not the quantity. We want to make sure that our KPIs are about the performance of a process, not something else. And I like to think of collecting and creating process KPIs just in time, not just in case. So if we're going to use it, then we'll create it and think about it a lot. If we're not going to use it, what's the point? And then the measurement method, where's the performance data going to come from? That's an important filter to think about what's a viable KPI. So let's have a look at each of those four in turn. So, bad news, there is no prize for having the most process KPIs. Sometimes it feels like there is a prize like that out there somewhere, because people will tell me proudly of their 200, 300 process KPIs. Now, that's not an active management list. That's a list for sure, but it's not much more than that, because we can't deal with that many. So, we're only going to create them when we want them, and it's going to be a much smaller list than that. So we're always looking to say, what's the minimum number of process KPIs, minimum number of targets that would allow us to achieve our organisational performance goals? The next symptom that we need to be able to deal with is to make sure that we're talking about a KPI that relates to the performance of a process, not to something else, not to some functional entity or team or person, project. So we're talking here about process KPIs. One of the symptoms, I think, of KPI disease is to find that someone has gone through the big long list of functional KPIs that you might have. It came out of your strategy work, your balanced scorecard perhaps, and you've got lots of quite detailed functional KPIs. Nothing wrong with that, but they're not process KPIs. So to go through the exercise of saying, okay, let's map our functional KPIs somehow onto our process architecture, I think is pointless. I mean, they're measuring different things. So we need to be very careful that the process KPIs we're coming up with are not just a cut and paste of other KPIs that exist, but they actually relate to the performance of the process in question. So we need to be quite focused on the process in focus and the measurement of its performance. And it feels sometimes like we've made the big long list of KPIs just in case we need them, and we don't need to do that, and it's pointless. If we don't need them, don't create them. What is the point of having 100 KPIs defined if you're going to use 20 or 30 of them? If you ever needed to use some of the others later, you'd need to go back and review them anyway. So let's produce our process KPIs just in time, not just in case. And then the fourth of the symptoms that I'm talking about here is about how do we get the performance data? Now that might seem straightforward, but take this example. We say our KPI is going to be about customer satisfaction, and then we're going to have a target. Let's say it's 90% of customers will rate us at least 9 out of 10, something like that. That sounds reasonable. And then you say, okay, where's the data going to come from? And someone writes in that little cell of the table, they just write, we'll run a survey. Okay, all good. Except you need a lot more knowledge about that survey, don't you? How often? Who's going to do it? How are we going to do it? Who do we need to survey? How many responses do we need for statistical significance? Do we have all of the data we need to even conduct the survey? I mean, if we say, for example, we're going to do it via email, do we have the emails of customers? And is that a representative sample of our customers? Or do we just happen to have the emails of some customers and not others? Or maybe we collected those emails from some particular sample of the customers that's going to bias our survey. All sorts of things for us to think about. I'm not saying it's not possible. Of course it's possible, but we need to think about it. And we need to make sure that the effort is going to be sustainable and we're not going to find that it's just too hard to collect the data. So what's the measurement method for the KPI? That's always going to be important, because if that gets too hard, again, that's just another way of overburdening us with activity that's not going to be sustained, and pretty soon we'll find ourselves not doing any process performance measurement. And if we're not doing that, we're not doing management. If we're not doing that, we're not doing improvement. And what's the point? Now, we need to avoid KPI disease, and the good news is that there is a vaccine, a double jab vaccine. Let me explain the two jabs. The first one perhaps I've alluded to already, and it's pretty straightforward in a way. It just says every KPI you create, every one you define in detail, you must use. Now, you've got hundreds of processes that you could define some sort of KPI for, but you may not want to manage hundreds of KPIs and even more targets. So this is the way I think about active process management. And you've seen this diagram before in another video. We spent the whole video going through this diagram, so I won't go through the details here. But just to show what I mean about the active use of KPIs in process management, we'll look at the bottom two sections here, which for me define active process management. And here in this red section, we're defining performance, what would good look like? And in the green section, we're managing performance. Let's just look at the questions here. It's like 6 questions that define active process management. So what do the stakeholders want from the process? What measures would track those objectives? So now we've got KPIs, and what level of performance is required. So this is about defining the KPIs and the targets for those KPIs. Okay, so that's straightforward. But here's the thing. We need to then be collecting that data and analysing it and assessing it, looking for performance gaps. Maybe that's caused by a new opportunity, or maybe it's caused by some current or emergent problem. But we need to be looking at that all the time. And then we need to assess the impact of that gap. I mean, sure, there's a gap. Is it worth fixing? What's the cost of fixing it? What's the cost of not fixing it? Should we fix it now? What happens if we fix it later and not now? All of those kinds of impact analysis questions. And then if we decide there's a business case for closing the gap, then we get on and close it. And then we need to make sure that it has been closed. We need to test whether what we did had the impact that we want. And this kind of loop here, particularly the green section, needs to be happening more or less at the cadence of the process execution. That's not something we do once a year. If this is a process that is executing on a daily, a weekly, a monthly basis, then it's probably, at least weekly and monthly, if not daily, we're going to look at the data. Every time the process executes, it's presumably going to create performance data. It gives us the opportunity to assess what's going on, because we don't want too much latency between our analysis and actual real life of the process, because there might be problems that we're missing out on. So if we think about every KPI that we define in detail, then we need to use it, and we need to use it in this way. That might cut back on people's enthusiasm for having hundreds of process KPIs. It certainly would for me. So let's review. What was the second jab for our vaccine? And I think it's about incremental development. So sometimes we'll say, okay, we're only going to manage the high impact processes. Let's say that's 30 processes. And that's a common strategy, and I think a valid one. But 30 might even sound like a lot. Well, maybe we don't have to do 30. If I'm working with a client and we've built the process architecture, so initially we'd have 3 levels of management, core and supporting processes, and that's something like 250 to 350 processes. That's a lot. Take the lowest level there, 250. That's still too many to try and manage actively. So we're only ever going to do the high impact processes, and a reasonable number might be that that's 30 processes. But even that's a lot to start with, so don't start with that. Start with 3. Just pick 3 processes and put them under active management, as we've just been describing. Collect the data, analyze it, get that circle of analysis going. And now, once we've got those 3 under active management and it's gone well, then add another 3. And now we've got 6 processes under active management. We've got 6 process owners who understand the role. Our data collection, data analysis, data reporting processes are in pretty good shape. So now the next increment, maybe we could add another 6 or another 10 because we're getting good at it. So pretty soon, and maybe it's in 2 or 3 or 4 months, it's not a long time, we can get to our 30 active high-impact processes under management. And that's what we need to do, I think. That's a much better deal than having 200 KPI definitions that we really don't use. Let's just focus on the minimum number of processes, the minimum number of targets for the minimum number of KPIs that will let us achieve our goal of improving organisational performance. So let's summarise that. Clearly, process KPIs are important. The whole thing about process-based management is to improve the performance of those processes. That's what we're here for. So the KPIs are going to be important, but only if we're using them and actively using them and using them in a mindful kind of way. If we're just making big long lists of processes, then what's the point of that? By our own process definitions, that's waste to be eliminated. And we really don't want to be in that position. So let's be very mindful about our KPIs. Let's have as many as we need, but no more. Let's define them well, let's use them actively, and let's make sure we're improving organisational performance. Stay safe, avoid KPI disease.